In addition to using keyframes to control your animation, you can apply what's called a motion controller to your object. When I select an object and go to the Motion panel, I can apply a motion controller to that object. The motion controller tells 3D Studio Max how to move the object through space, whether it be along a Bezier curve path, a linear path, based on some sort of mathematical function, and so on. There are two buttons under this panel. There's the Parameters button and the Trajectories button. The Parameters button has four rollouts: the Assign Controller rollout, the PRS or Position, Rotation, Scale rollout, the Key Info Basic rollout, and the Key Info Advanced rollout. The Trajectories button has one rollout, the Trajectories rollout. Let's start with our parameters. The first of the rollouts is the Assign Controller parameter. This is where we assign a motion controller to an object's transform as a whole, or individually to an object's position, rotation, or scale transforms. You can see in the hierarchy that I can use the minus sign to contract the hierarchy and the plus sign to expand it. This is similar to the track view. You'll also notice that to the right of these descriptive names, for example transform, there's a colon and then an example or a listing of what is the current motion controller. Each object has a motion controller default assigned to it. Right now the default position is a Bezier position. The default rotation transform is a TCB rotation. And the default scale is the Bezier scale transform or controller. If I want to add a new controller or change the controller, I can click on any one of these four and then click on this button, the Assign Controller button. If I click on it now, I'm going to get motion controllers that are specific for scale. I have audio scale, the default, which is Bezier scale, and I can tell it's the default because there's a little greater than sign to the left of it. I have linear scale. I can scale based on some noise function, which is a mathematical function. I can use a mathematical expression to scale, and so on. To apply a new one of these motion controllers to my scale transform, I select it from the list and click OK. And you can see in my hierarchy there's a plus sign now next to the scale. When I click on that plus sign, it expands the hierarchy to show me that I have a scale, data, motion controller applied to this object. I'm going to undo that. If I click on rotation and click on the Assign Controller button, I have rotation related motion controllers that can be applied to that transform, the rotation. And the same for position and for the overall transform. The next rollout is the PRS parameters, or position, rotation, scale parameters. When I expand this rollout, I see 6 buttons and then 3 buttons at the bottom. The top 6 buttons let me create a key or delete a key for rotation, position, and scale for my object at a particular point in time. Right now, at the first frame, frame 0, I have no keys, denoted by these grayed out keys. I can't delete anything if it's not there. I can add a key by clicking on one of these buttons on the left for Create Key, and it'll create a keyframe for that point in time, in this case, frame 0. When I do this, you'll notice that in my other views, I can see a white box around my object. If I move my timeline forward, the box disappears. If I move back to where the keyframe is, the box appears again. This simply tells me that there is a keyframe at this point in time for this object. I can delete the key by clicking on the Delete Position key under the PRS parameters, and the white box goes away. I'm going to add a position key at a couple of different points, and then I'm going to move on to the next rollout. You can see now when I move through time that when I get to where there's a keyframe from my sphere, the box appears. My next rollout is the KeyInfo Basic rollout. This lets me change my parameters for X, Y, and Z for a given point in time for a given keyframe. Under the PRS parameters, these last three buttons, position, rotation, and scale, determine what type of information I'm looking at in my KeyInfo Basic and KeyInfo Advanced. So if I click on rotation, and I look under my KeyInfo now, this is rotation values for X, Y, and Z. If I click on scale, I now have scale values for X, Y, and Z. Let's go back to position. If I move forward in time a little bit, you can see this grays out because I'm off of a keyframe. If I move back to a frame that has a keyframe, my values are accessible. At the top of my KeyInfo Basic window or rollout, I have these two buttons, a left arrow and a right arrow, and then a field telling me what keyframe I'm on. In this case, keyframe number 1, the first keyframe in my animation. I can go through my keyframes by clicking to the right to move forward through my keyframes, to go to my second, third, and fourth keyframes, and you can see the time here is denoted in this time box and can be changed by moving the scroller. And I can move back by clicking the back arrow to move backwards through my keyframes. At these keyframe times, I can change the values for X position, Y position, and Z position of my object. Below these XYZ value rollers, I have these two rollout buttons. These are my trajectory shapes, or my trajectory curves. These determine how my motion occurs in and out of my keyframes. So coming towards and moving away from my keyframes, the motion follows these set shapes. The arrows to the left and right of these two flyouts let me copy, in the case of this left arrow right here, let me copy the keyframe information trajectory, or the curve from here to the previous keyframe. The right arrow for the in flyout lets me copy the curve from the previous keyframe to this keyframe. For the out trajectory flyout, the two arrows have a different function. The left arrow copies the next keyframe's curve to this current keyframe. The right arrow copies this current keyframe's curve to the next keyframe. The KeyInfo Advanced essentially lets me change the velocity at a given keyframe. I can change the in and out times for the velocity, and I can also normalize the time, meaning even it out. Or I can click on the constant velocity checkbox to make the velocity of this object through space and time constant. The Trajectories button lets me actually see the trajectory of my object. When I click on it and my object is selected, I can see the motion path or the trajectory of that object. And by scrubbing the timeline, by moving it to the left and right, I can see that my object is actually following along that path. This is a very, very powerful feature in that I can see where my object is going to go before it actually goes there. But it doesn't stop there. Under the Trajectories rollout, I can select a specific keyframe, and I can delete or add a keyframe. To do this, I need to click on Subobject and select the keys or keyframes. Now I can move to a specific keyframe and delete or add a keyframe at any point along the trajectory or the path. I can change the sample range, for example the start and end time, so I'm only going to be going through a certain range of motion. I can change the number of samples along that line, higher meaning better resolution and lower meaning less resolution. I can also convert the spline or the trajectory. I can convert this trajectory to a spline or convert a trajectory from a spline. I can collapse the transform, so I can collapse all of the transformations into one, either position, rotation, scale, or all of them. So let's summarize. My trajectories let me see the motion of my object through space. The trajectory is this blue line, and the keyframes are the white boxes along that blue line. When I edit the subobject keys, I can physically move these keyframes by clicking on the box and moving it in space in any one of my views. This changes the motion path along which my object moves. Now my object follows that trajectory that I've edited by clicking on the subobject keys. The parameter settings let me assign controllers to the transform as a whole or to the position, rotation, and scale individually. I can expand and contract this hierarchy by clicking on the plus or minus sign. If I select one of these, I can click on the Assign Controller button to assign a specific motion controller to that object. The PRS parameters let me create or delete keyframes at any point in time. The rotation, position, and scale buttons at the bottom of the PRS parameters determine what type of information I'm looking at in the KeyInfo Basic and KeyInfo Advanced. If I'm looking at position, the information under these two rollouts will be for position only. If I click on rotation, it will be for rotation only. If I click on scale, it will be for scale only. Motion controllers are the key to complex animations in 3D Studio Max.